bell tolled once, and then vanished, as if sound itself had recoiled from the guilt it carried. In the hush that followed, a secret stirred beneath the surface of reason, too quiet for most ears to hear. This is a tale of echoes, of a crime hidden in plain sound, of remorse that refused to fade, and of silence more damning than words. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a bleak November morning in the year 1895 that I found myself once again treading the familiar steps of Baker Street, my coat collar upturned against the wind and a fresh London drizzle misting my spectacles. The fire in Holmes' sitting room was already lit, though it gave little cheer against the gloom outside. I had scarcely crossed the threshold when I perceived at once a peculiar stillness in the room, not merely of sound, but of movement and thought. Holmes was seated in his armchair, legs drawn up, his long fingers steepled before his face, in that attitude of inward concentration which I had come to associate with the earliest rumblings of a case. He did not rise, nor did he greet me with more than a faint glance from behind his interlocked fingers. I took my usual place opposite him and remained silent for some moments, loath to disturb the strange atmosphere that had settled like a fog upon the room. I had seen my friend in many moods, restless, exhilarated, even morose, but this particular stillness had an edge to it that felt almost expectant. "I have been listening, Watson," he said at last, his voice so low it seemed to stir the air no more than a whisper. "To what?" I asked. "To nothing, or rather, to what lies beneath nothing." His eyes met mine, with that peculiar brightness which always accompanied one of his more abstract reflections. We are accustomed to listen for voices, for footsteps, for telegrams rattling at the door. But silence, true silence, it has its own frequencies. One must train the mind to hear it. I smiled, uncertain whether he spoke in jest. "And what has it told you this morning?" He gave a faint shrug. "Only that something approaches. I can hear its footfall in the spaces where no sound dwells." Before I could press him further, a soft knock came at the door, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a visitor, a thin, elderly man in a dark overcoat and gloves, his hair greying in a halo of academic neglect. He entered with hesitation, removing his hat but not his gloves, and upon hearing the faint chime of the mantel clock as it struck the half-hour, he visibly winced. Holmes did not rise, but gestured to the chair opposite him. The gentleman looked at it as though it might ignite beneath him, and instead hovered near the hearth. "No," he murmured abruptly, his voice tight. "Not near the fire. And, if you please, may the chimes be stopped." I confess I was taken aback. There was about the man the unmistakable bearing of the academic, the slight stoop, the furrowed brow, and the absent-minded air. But something in his manner spoke not of forgetfulness, but of dread. He moved with the careful tread of one who fears invisible tripwires in his path. His eyes, though sharp, darted about the room in search of threat rather than meaning. Holmes studied him keenly, but without speech, allowing the tension to rise like steam from a kettle. I had the distinct impression that our visitor was more afraid of what he might hear than what he might say. The man turned his gaze upon Holmes with sudden desperation. "I must ask, implore, that you stop the chiming. Any bell, even that infernal little clock. I cannot abide it, Mr. Holmes. I cannot think. The sound, it is not merely sound. It follows me." Holmes inclined his head, and with an almost imperceptible motion, reached forward and muffled the small brass clock with a silk handkerchief. As the man exhaled in relief, Holmes' eyes moved over him with the precision of a surgeon. I saw his gaze note the faint tremor of the man's left hand, the ink stains on his right cuff, the nervous tapping of a foot against the floorboards. The gloved fingers fidgeted not from cold, but from calculation and fear. "Very well," Holmes said at last. "Let us hear why a man of logic fears a bell." It would be no exaggeration to say that in all my years beside Sherlock Holmes, I had never seen a client arrive quite so haunted. And though I could not then guess the full nature of his fear, I knew at once that we had stepped into a puzzle unlike any we had faced before. Professor Tobias Ellicott did not sit immediately. He stood by the hearth as though unsure if the furniture might betray him, then moved with jerky restraint to the edge of the armchair opposite Holmes, perching there rather than settling. "I have been receiving letters, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice papery yet clipped. "Anonymous, of course. The first arrived 6 months past. It bore no signature, only the words, 'The bell remembers.'" He removed a packet from within his coat, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I burned the first few, I'm ashamed to say. Superstition got the better of me, but I kept the later ones. I thought perhaps someone might make sense of them." Holmes untied the packet with the same solemnity he would afford an ancient manuscript. The letters were of varying length, but all written in the same painstakingly neat hand, free of smudges or crossings out. The last of them read simply, "You have until the last tolling, then you shall be answered. They come on Thursdays," Ellicott said, "without fail, always by hand, no postage mark. And have you seen the messenger?" "Never." Holmes turned one letter to the light, examining its creases. An elegant script, controlled, a man, I should say, educated, likely older, and deliberate. The professor exhaled. "There's more, far more, and you must understand, I have no enemies, Mr. Holmes. None living, at any rate." It was some minutes before Ellicott continued. He removed his gloves slowly, folding them as though in ceremony, and laid them on his knee. "I have spent my life at St. Romuald's College, Cambridge. My work has been in symbolic logic, pure, theoretical, of no interest to anyone outside a very narrow circle. Yet I believe this has something to do with the past. A past I had buried." Holmes remained motionless. "There was a man," Ellicott said quietly. "He and I were doctoral candidates together. We collaborated for a time, on acoustics of all things, resonance patterns. He had a theory about vibrations and their effect on memory. It was eccentric, even then. I published a portion of it as my own, just a footnote. Just once." "And the man?" Holmes asked. "His name was Carl Hatherley. He died shortly thereafter. Tuberculosis, I believe. The paper was well received. The subject abandoned." Holmes did not look up. "Ideas have long memories, Professor." "Yes," Ellicott said. "And if these letters come from someone who knew, someone who feels I stole more than a theory, they may believe I stole a life." "There is something else," Ellicott said, hesitating. Holmes gave the smallest nod. "I've heard it twice. The bell. Not the college chime, not St. Romuald's. Something older, lower. It does not match the tone of any bell I know." "You heard it where?" Holmes asked. "In my chambers, in the dead of night. I sat upright, fully awake. There could be no mistake. The sound was inside the walls. It rang 3 times, evenly spaced. The second time, it was followed by silence so profound I could hear the tick of my own heartbeat. Was it heard by anyone else? No one. And yet it shook you." "I cannot explain it, Mr. Holmes," said Ellicott, his voice faltering. "But I do not think it was a warning. I think it was a sentence, passed and sealed." Holmes said nothing for a time. Then, folding the last of the letters, he asked, "How long between the first and most recent?" 6 months exactly. "And the next Thursday?" Ellicott swallowed. "This week." Though I had seen clients arrive with trembling hands and hunted eyes, There was something in Ellicott that struck a different chord. He did not seem mad, though he spoke of spectral bells, nor was he theatrical. Rather, his fear wore the shape of logic, as if each worry had been carefully calculated and verified. He showed no signs of deception, but the absence of deceit is not always the presence of truth. His mind, I thought, was attempting to solve its own unravelling, and in doing so, it was only tightening the knot. I had seen battlefield nerves, shell-shocked men who mistook thunder for artillery, but Ellicott was a scholar haunted not by the chaos of war, but by the symmetry of guilt. Holmes, who had said nothing for several minutes, now stirred. He took the letters once more and arranged them on the table, not by date, but by handwriting pressure. He sniffed one envelope and scraped its wax seal gently with his fingernail. "You have ceased using your inkstand at the desk," he remarked suddenly. Ellicott blinked. "Yes, I now write exclusively at the window." "Curious," Holmes said. "The ink stains on your cuff are older than a week, but fresh enough to have been worn during nocturnal calculations. The wear on your shoes tells of pacing, not walking. And your eyes, red at the corners, but not from drink. Sleeplessness. You are working through the problem by night, and," here he sniffed a corner of one page, "you burned a rejected draft within the last 48 hours. You've been trying to answer the riddle alone." Ellicott looked down. "It is the habit of men of reason," Holmes said mildly. "They are the most reluctant to admit when reason has turned traitor." Ellicott nodded once, tightly. Holmes returned the letters. "I shall need to see the room." The professor leaned forward. "Then you will come to Cambridge?" "I shall." "Soon?" "Before Thursday." Ellicott exhaled slowly, as if releasing weeks of tension in that one breath. "I believe something is planned. I cannot say how I know, but the last note was different. It felt like a conclusion." Holmes made no comment. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "if this is vengeance, then it is vengeance sharpened by time. And time, as I now see, is the cruelest of all blades. There are hours I dare not be alone. Please, see what I cannot." Holmes inclined his head. "Leave the letters with me. We shall join you within 2 days. And, Professor—" "Yes?" "Do not trust silence." As Ellicott departed, the mantel clock began to strike the hour. He flinched once more, then vanished into the fog. Holmes stood very still, then murmured, "There are crimes committed with blood, and others, rarer ones, carried in ink, in tones, and in the tremble of a bell long stilled. Let us be swift, Watson. Time has a habit of catching the guilty, and the guilty of catching time." It was 2 days hence that Holmes and I found ourselves disembarking at Cambridge, wrapped in scarves and cloaks against a lingering November mist that clung to the very spires of the ancient colleges. St. Romuald's stood aloof even among its peers, its cloisters weathered by time and scholarship, its walls lined with a silence older than any still living fellow within. As we passed under the porter's arch, Holmes walked a pace ahead of me, his eyes not on the ivy-choked masonry but fixed upward, as if the secrets of the place hung in the fog above. He said nothing as we crossed the quadrangle, save for a low comment when the old chapel bell gave a mournful toll. "A minor third," he murmured, low, distorted, and yet familiar. The porter led us through a side passage and up 2 narrow flights, where the air grew stale and cold. When we reached the professor's door, Holmes paused and ran a finger along the frame. "Dust, Watson," he said, "but disturbed in the last 6 hours. We are expected, but not, I think, with joy." The professor's rooms were like a mind left too long to its own devices, cluttered, brilliant, and on the verge of collapse. The first impression was one of unnatural stillness. There was no tick of clock, no gentle creak of board or hinge. Even the bell pull hung stiffly against the wall, as if ordered into silence. Curtains had been drawn, and pinned down at their corners, allowing in only a filtered grey light. Books lay in piles, some opened mid-paragraph, others dog-eared and stacked at odd angles, their titles obscured. The air smelled faintly of ink, tobacco, and something metallic. Holmes moved through the chamber with feline precision, not speaking. He paused by the hearth, where the grate was packed with ash but showed no sign of recent use. He stepped to the desk, touched a blotter that had dried long ago, then ran a hand beneath the windowsill. "There is method in this madness," he said. "Note the positioning of the books, not abandoned, but arranged. He's built a rampart, though against what, one can only guess." I glanced at the bell pull again and shuddered. Whatever Ellicott feared, it had begun here. At the far end of the chamber stood a tall, iron birdcage. Empty, save for a single white feather curled in the corner like a whisper left behind. Holmes stooped before it, eyes gleaming. "No seed, no droppings," he murmured. The bird was not long in residence. Its removal was recent and not voluntary. He moved next to the bell pull, where he examined the surrounding plaster and fabric with exaggerated care. A smudge of soot lingered just above the bracket, too high for a candle, too low for chimney smoke. Holmes sniffed the air. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you notice anything unusual about the atmosphere?" "Only that it feels unnaturally dense." "Exactly. As though something once moved through it that should not have. Vibration, perhaps. Directed sound." He pressed the wall behind the bell pull and found resistance. "There is padding here, installed recently, not for warmth, for silence." He turned then to a pile of books. They were not theological or philosophical, as I expected, but mechanical treatises on resonance, harmonics, pressure. Whatever Ellicott feared, Holmes had begun to trace its outline, not in ink, but in air. At Holmes's request, we were granted a brief audience with Professor Don Larrabee, Fellow of Mathematics and, if reputation served, one of Cambridge's more formidable intellects. He greeted us with a look of slight irritation, as though Holmes were a wayward equation intruding on his mental calculations. "Ellicott," he said when we posed our inquiries, "brilliant once, though brilliance, like candlelight, does tend to flicker." "You've noticed a decline?" I ventured. "He avoids hall, no lectures, spends all hours brooding in that cell of his. Says the bells trouble him. Nonsense, of course. Everyone knows Romuald's bells are off by a semitone." Holmes smiled thinly. "And yet he hears others." "Then he hears ghosts," Larrabee snapped. "He was always dramatic. Once published a paper on artificial memory storage using resonance. Called it a phonetic lattice." "Absurd." "But not original?" Holmes asked mildly. Larrabee stiffened. "He wasn't the only mind in the room when it was conceived." "Indeed," Holmes said, "and perhaps not the only one in the room now." Larrabee's lip curled, but he said nothing more. As we departed, Holmes turned to me. "Envy, Watson," he said. "A much louder sound than bells, but far less tuneful." Our next visit was to the lower reading hall, where we were introduced to Mr. Horace Pike, the college librarian, a man who had not laid eyes on a page in 20 years. His blindness, the result of a chemical mishap, had neither dulled his memory nor dimmed his regard for the power of words. He welcomed us with courteous formality, and upon hearing Ellicott's name, offered a curious smile. "He was a bright boy," Pike said, "but not as clever as he believed." "You knew him well?" Holmes asked. "I knew his voice, his pride, and once, his companion." "A woman?" Holmes inquired. "My sister, Miriam. She used to visit him in secret, often through the North Gate late in the afternoons. He promised her things. Love, scholarship, a life." "And?" "She died," Pike replied simply. "They said it was nerves. I always suspected otherwise." Holmes was silent. "You're looking for answers," Pike said. Then you must listen to the bell tower. Why? Because it remembers, Pike whispered. The stones hold the echo of every vow made and broken beneath them. In the dusty workshop beneath the chapel, we found a young man surrounded by bits of brass and bell mechanisms. He introduced himself as Alfred Sims, a second-year student of engineering and, by his own admission, a devotee of campanology. I've been restoring the tower gears, he said, beaming. The whole chime system was half rotted through. No one uses it now, but I thought, why not? Holmes crouched beside a half-assembled mechanism. And has anyone else shown interest in your work? Not really, except old Professor Brand. He asked about resonant frequencies and bell harmonics. Unusual questions for a chemist. Brand? Holmes repeated quietly. Sims nodded. Odd fellow. Comes by at strange hours. Wanted to know if a certain pitch could be tuned to match a human heartbeat. Holmes straightened slowly. And what did you tell him? That it's possible, Sims said, grinning. With the right materials and a bit of patience. Holmes thanked him, then murmured to me as we left, there are mechanisms built not for time, but for minds. It was an aged porter who provided the thread Holmes had long been fingering. We found him in the porter's lodge, sipping weak tea and wrapped in 2 scarves despite the mild day. When asked about Ellicott's early years, the old man's expression turned vague, then thoughtful. There was a girl, he said after a pause. Used to wait by the bell tower, never came through the main gate. Pale thing, with gloves too fine for a servant. Holmes leaned in. Do you remember her name? No, sir, but I remember her silence. Never said a word, just waited until the bells stopped, then went up. Up, to the tower, always when Ellicott was alone. He grew quiet again, and I felt a strange melancholy. There was something sorrowful in the way he spoke, like a man who had watched a ghost without knowing it. People forget faces, he muttered, but the tower never forgets footsteps. Back in Ellicott's rooms, Holmes examined a half-burnt envelope that had been discarded in the study grate. The paper was thick and watermarked, but it was the seal that caught his interest. A faint impression in the wax, barely visible, but enough. This, he said, holding it to the light, is the seal of the Argonaut Society. I stared. A student society? A rather exclusive one. Established in 1842, only 4 living members remain. Ellicott is one, Brand is another. And the other 2? One's in India, the other, he said, died 2 years ago, by suicide. Holmes turned the envelope over. This was no discarded correspondence. It was a message to himself, a reminder, or perhaps a confession. He looked again at the wax, but someone else used the same ring. That means access and intent. And vengeance? Holmes gave no reply, but tucked the envelope into his pocket with care. Watson, he said at last, there is a signature in silence, and someone has been writing with it for years. Holmes spent that evening pacing Ellicott's study, pausing only to scratch notes on the back of a torn envelope or peer through the thick fog pressing against the window panes. I sat near the hearth with a growing unease, not for Holmes' silence, which was a familiar companion, but for the singular intensity it now wore. Watson, he said suddenly, recall what the professor said. About resonance. About a theory once stolen and buried. Yes, I said. His late colleague, Carl Hatherley. Holmes nodded. Hatherley's work was never published, but the ideas live. You saw those treatises on resonance in Ellicott's chamber. He has been revisiting the very mechanism he once claimed to dismiss. I frowned. But why? Guilt? Perhaps, or necessity, but more crucially, it suggests the device was never fully theoretical. He drew a scrap of parchment from his coat and laid it before me. A sketch, a bell-shaped chamber, with annotations I could scarcely follow. Ellicott did not merely borrow Hatherley's work. He built it, he tested it, and he buried it, until now. And someone has exhumed it, I murmured. Precisely, the letters. The tones in the night. These are not hauntings, Watson. They are experiments. Carefully orchestrated reminders of a crime once wrapped in theory and now echoing in consequence. It was late that same night when Holmes knocked at the door of the college library. The hour was inappropriate, but Mr. Pike received us without question, as though he had anticipated the visit from the start. "My sister's name," he said before Holmes could speak, "was Miriam Pike." Holmes inclined his head. "And she died while under the care of a physician?" "A sanatorium," Pike replied. "After what they called an auditory delusion, she said she could hear bells. Bells that no one else could hear." "And when did these episodes begin?" "Shortly after she stopped seeing Ellicott. I felt a chill then, one deeper than mere air could bring." "Did she ever describe the sound?" "She said it rang not in her ears, but behind her eyes," Pike whispered. "As if it had passed through her bones." Holmes folded his arms. "And Ellicott, he vanished from her life. No explanation, no visit. I believe she came here to find him. Once. She returned, shaken, silent. She never spoke his name again." Pike leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, whatever you are unearthing, be warned. That tower has heard more lies than prayers, and some lies ring truer than truth when uttered by the wrong voice." Holmes bowed slightly. "It is not the tower I fear, Mr. Pike. It is the man who once climbed it." We returned to our lodgings in silence, but I could see the machinery of Holmes' mind working with relentless precision. The pieces had begun to align, but not in any form I yet recognized. "Holmes," I said finally, "you believe Miriam's madness was induced, not natural?" He turned slowly. "I believe it was engineered, Watson, like any good device." "But how?" He tapped the side of his own head. "The human mind is more attuned than most realize. Certain frequencies bypass the conscious ear and affect the nervous system directly. Hatherley's theory proposed that targeted resonance could alter perception, blur memory, induce dread, even trigger hallucinations." "You mean the bell wasn't metaphorical?" "On the contrary, it was precise, calculated. Bell harmonics, Watson, are not simply sounds. They are weapons in the hands of a man who understands their language." I sat back, stunned. Holmes went on. "Miriam's collapse occurred during the early days of Ellicott's research. That is not coincidence. He tested it on her, knowingly or not. And now the same tones are being turned against him." "Yes," Holmes said grimly. "But this time, they are no longer theoretical. They are tuned for revenge." He returned to his papers. "We must determine who holds the tuning fork now." By the following morning, Holmes' suspicions had found form. He summoned me to Ellicott's room, where the professor sat curled beneath a blanket, hands trembling despite the warmth. "You said the bell was heard thrice?" Holmes asked. Ellicott nodded. "And the last?" "Still to come," he whispered. Holmes crouched before the hearth, then pointed to the floor beneath the desk. A small panel had been pried loose and resealed. "Did you know," he said conversationally, "that frequency-based devices, when calibrated with care, can function from a distance? That they do not require volume to induce harm, only precision?" Ellicott said nothing. "I believe someone has reconstructed the very mechanism you once denied existed," Holmes continued, "and placed it in the tower above your chambers." The professor looked up, pale as paper. "To what end?" "To drive you mad," Holmes said. "Or failing that, dead. The resonance used upon your mind is not random. It is calculated to induce stress, hallucination, cardiac tremors. You are being dismantled, Professor. One nerve at a time." He stood. "And I know who built the mechanism." "Who?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me with a pleasant glint of anger. "Someone who knew Miriam's mind," he said, "and watched it break. It was on the walk back through the Mist Vale quadrangle that I dared to press Holmes further. "You say you know who built the mechanism," I said. "You believe it was Professor Brand?" Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "I said I knew who built it, Watson. I did not say who had set it in motion." "Then you suspect another?" "I suspect many things," he replied. "Resonance, guilt, grief. They rarely walk alone." He fell silent again, then added, "There are sounds, my dear Watson, that do not fade with time. They lodge in the mind, subtle and corrosive. That bell Ellicott fears, it is not just an instrument, it is a reminder. A reminder of what? Of what a man allows to ring unchallenged within his conscience." His vagueness maddened me. "Then you still will not tell me your theory?" He offered a rare, tired smile. "Not yet. It is still tuning itself." That night, as I lay awake, I heard no bells, but Holmes' words rang in my mind nonetheless, half-truths and riddles wrapped in smoke, each one tolling towards something I could not yet see. The next morning brought a curious flurry of activity. Holmes had sent 2 telegrams, made 3 inquiries by messenger, and most curiously, arranged for a short item to appear in the Cambridge Courier. It read, "Professor T. Ellicott to lecture on memory, mechanism, and morality. Thursday evening, St. Romuald's Lecture Hall. All fellows invited." I confronted Holmes upon reading it. "This is a lie," I said. He did not deny it. "Indeed, but a useful one." "You intend to draw out the villain?" "I intend," Holmes replied, "to play the final note and see who flinches." He explained nothing further, save that Ellicott would not be present that night. Instead, the professor had been quietly moved to a safe location under the care of a college physician. "And if the culprit takes the bait," I asked, "then he will enter the tower," Holmes said, "for the final adjustment, a crescendo as it were. And if he doesn't," Holmes smiled, "he will. The machine requires precision. It must be attuned to Ellicott's location. He cannot risk improvisation, not if the goal is effective." His eyes gleamed. "This is no lecture, Watson. It is an orchestration, and I mean to conduct it." The day passed in silence, a silence so profound it seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Holmes spoke little, save for a few instructions and a single question about the angle of sound refraction through stone, one I could not begin to answer. As evening fell, and the shadows gathered like cloaked conspirators around the ancient spires, I watched Holmes prepare with the quiet intensity of a violinist before a final performance. "Are you certain he will come?" I asked. "No," Holmes said. "But certainty is a poor substitute for necessity. He must come, because the bell, his bell, has not yet rung. And if he discovers the truth, then he will discover it too late." He checked the time, then turned to me with that odd glint I'd come to associate not with excitement but something colder, resolve. "You see, Watson," he said, "this is not merely about murder. It is about melody, about justice, tuned to frequency." The tower stood quiet, but Holmes's face told me the concert had already begun, and somewhere in the dark, the final bell waited, its toll silent for now. The evening fell with a heaviness that seemed to press the very fog into the pores of the stone around us. Holmes and I positioned ourselves in the cloister beneath the north wing of St. Romuald's, beneath the old bell tower, where the final movement of our strange symphony was to begin. There was no sound, save for the slow dripping of water from the worn gargoyle above us and the distant murmur of students long since retreated to their beds. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. He held his watch in one hand, and the other rested lightly on the butt of his walking stick, an affectation I'd long since recognized as anything but ornamental. "At what hour do you expect him?" I whispered. "He will come before the clock strikes 1, Holmes murmured. "The resonance must be tested while the hall is still and the vibrations optimal. He cannot risk an interruption. And if he doesn't appear, then the man I seek does not exist," he said simply. And I shall owe you supper at Simpson's for the remainder of the month. I would have smiled, but the weight in his voice denied humour. The fog thickened, cloaking the path in shadows. I heard Holmes draw breath, sharp, still, and a faint click of a metal on stone echoed high above. "Watson," he said, voice low and taut, "the overture has begun. Keep your eyes down and your ears open." The first sound was barely more than a whisper, like a shoe brushing against old mortar. Then came a shadow, tall, deliberate, and cloaked. As it passed beneath the arch and toward the base of the bell tower, I held my breath. Holmes touched my sleeve once, then was gone. He moved as he always did when the moment called for silence, with the swiftness of thought and the stillness of ice. Within seconds he had vanished into the dark stone belly of the tower, leaving me behind to listen. The minutes dragged. The only sound was the beat of my own heart, far louder than I should have liked. I strained to hear anything, footsteps, shifting wood, a gasp, but the tower remained as mute as a confessional. Suddenly, a soft vibration passed through the ground beneath me. It was not a sound exactly, but something else, like the hum of a note not yet audible. My legs tensed. Something had begun within the tower, and I could not say whether it was mechanical or malevolent. Then, another sound, a voice, distant and low. Holmes's voice, calm, precise, unmistakable. "You should not have returned, Professor." The voice that answered was one I did not recognize, measured, laced with bitterness. And yet, here I am, Mr. Holmes, at the same threshold where my sister last stood. A silence, then Holmes again. "And do you propose to toll judgment tonight?" The man replied, "No, Mr. Holmes, only balance." I shivered. The sound rose once more, subtle, throbbing, like the tuning of an unseen string. Holmes had found his man. And I, standing alone beneath the ancient stone, could only wait for the final note. I strained to hear every word as they echoed faintly down the spiral stairwell of the bell tower. "You rebuilt it," Holmes said, "down to the frequency curve." "Yes," came Brand's reply, "and improved it. The original was crude, inelegant. My design accounts for resonance decay, internal pressure thresholds, and, more importantly, endurance of the subject's mind." "You speak as if Ellicott were merely a specimen." "He is," Brand said sharply. "A specimen of guilt. My sister trusted him. He stole Hatherley's work and used her as a subject. She heard the bell long before it ever tolled." Holmes' tone turned colder. "And now you intend to repay him in kind?" "No, Mr. Holmes," Brand replied. "Not in kind. In conclusion, the human body can only endure so much harmonic stress before the nervous system falters. At the right pitch, over the right duration, his heart will stop. No poison, no blood, just a final tone no one else will hear." There was a long pause, then Holmes's voice again, calm, almost amused. "A remarkably tidy murder. It is justice," Brand snapped. "Justice," Holmes echoed. "Or an aria rehearsed too long in the mind?" Another silence. Then Brand added, almost gently, "The bell will toll at 1. It is already set. Ellicott will not be in the hall. He will be here, above the chamber. The walls will carry it to him." Holmes spoke one final time, but I could not catch the words. The bell above me stirred slightly in its mount. Something had begun, and Holmes had either anticipated it, or we were too late to stop it. For several moments, the world seemed reduced to breath and stone. Then, I heard the subtle shift of metal against metal from above. A mechanism, a chain, the unmistakable vibration of something winding to release. Holmes' voice rose again, this time with authority. "Step away from the wall, Professor. The device has been sabotaged." "You lie," Brand hissed. "I rarely do," came the reply. You assumed I would follow you. I did, but not before ensuring your composition would play no final note. I heard a scuffle, boots scraping wood, a sharp intake of breath. Brand snarled. You cannot stop it. You don't know the signal. I didn't, Holmes admitted, until I found the parchment beneath your desk blotter, an elegant cipher, and easily overridden. The scraping ceased, then silence, a long, taut, terrible silence. Finally, I heard Holmes descend the stairs, slow and deliberate. Brand's footsteps followed, heavier, defeated. Holmes emerged from the tower first, his expression unreadable. I could see only a faint layer of soot along the one cuff, and the calmness of a man who had just outwitted death with 30 seconds to spare. Behind him came Brand, shoulders hunched, face pale, lips set in bitter resignation. Holmes spoke softly to me. He would have killed Ellicott without ever touching him. That is the genius and the horror of sound. We said nothing more as the constables arrived. The tower was silent once again, but I swear, as Brand was led away, I felt something stir in the stone. A pulse, perhaps, or the echo of a bell that never rang. The case, it seemed, had concluded with the arrest of Professor Mordecai Brand. The device, a feat of dreadful ingenuity, had been dismantled by Holmes himself. Ellicott, spared the fatal resonance, was transported safely to his family estate in Kent under medical supervision. And yet, something lingered. It was 2 days after Brand's arrest that I found Holmes back in Ellicott's old study, pacing once again between the desk and the hearth. He said little, but I sensed in him a restlessness, a piece yet unplaced, a note unresolved. You have questions, I said finally. Only one, he replied. Why build a device that requires such personal calibration unless you understand it intimately? You mean Brand. I mean Ellicott. He opened a drawer and retrieved the professor's old journal, worn at the corners, filled with dense equations and notations. At the back, in faded ink, lay a schematic, similar to the one Brand had used, identical in fact, save for one early signature, T.E. You're telling me, I said slowly, that Ellicott was the first to build it? The original mechanism, Holmes confirmed, was not Hatherley's. It was Ellicott's. Hatherley had the theory. Ellicott had the method. It was he who first tuned the frequency to affect Miriam Pike. Whether intentionally or not remains unknown. And Brand knew? Holmes nodded. He must have discovered the journal long after his sister's death. He rebuilt it, not out of curiosity, but vengeance, and in doing so, completed the circle. I felt a chill. But you didn't tell the authorities. Holmes closed the journal. Ellicott has already paid, Watson, with guilt, with silence, with a life so haunted that his own mind became the cage. He turned toward the window. Justice, he said quietly, does not always need a trial. Sometimes it only needs a bell. It was 2 days after the arrest of Professor Mordecai Brand when Holmes and I finally returned to Baker Street. The rain had left the pavements clean, but the air remained heavy, as though London itself had held its breath during our absence. Holmes, ever the picture of controlled precision, removed his overcoat with a flick of his wrist and settled into his armchair with the familiarity of ritual. A wisp of blue-grey smoke soon curled from his pipe, marking the beginning of his unravelling. I trust, he said between puffs, that you've been revisiting your notes with the proper sense of confusion. I have, I admitted. You saw far more than you let on. He inclined his head. A wise man once said that timing is the difference between fact and theatre. And what part of this farce was I in? You, my dear Watson, Holmes replied dryly, played the indispensable role of moral ballast. Charming, I muttered. He gestured toward the stack of newspapers on the table. They report a failed murder, a deranged professor and a curious contraption of wires and bells, but they lack the thread that binds it all, which is guilt, Holmes said simply, but not just Brand's. He tapped the side of his pipe and rose to retrieve a folder from his desk. Inside were notes, diagrams, even a fragment of scorched parchment. "Let us begin," he said, "with the soot." Holmes laid the folder before me with deliberate care, spreading its contents like a conjurer preparing his final act. Atop the bundle sat a shard of soot-streaked glass, no larger than a matchbox, but unmistakably part of the lancet window from the bell tower. "You recall," he began, "how the inner sill of the east-facing window bore a peculiar residue." "I do," I said. "You remarked upon it briefly." "Briefly, yes, but not idly. That soot was directional. It settled inwards, suggesting not just airflow but frequent displacement. The window had been opened from the inside, and repeatedly. To what end? To channel resonance. The bell chamber was not merely a setting, Watson. It was an instrument. Brand exploited the window's unique acoustics to carry low-frequency vibrations outward, much like a vented horn carries the force of a trumpet. I studied the notes more closely. "You believe the tones reached Ellicott at a distance?" "I know they did," Holmes replied. "He complained of phantom ringing even while in his country cottage. That cottage, I discovered, sat precisely along the old railway line, a corridor once used by Brand's experimental sound tests at Cambridge. It was not merely coincidence, it was design." He paused to light a fresh match, letting the flame dance along the edge of the glass shard. "And yet," he said, "none of it would have mattered were it not for one thing." "What's that?" "Ellicott's own mind. You see, he believed in the bell. That was the final stroke of Brand's genius. Not in building the mechanism, but in choosing a victim primed to hear it. And no one else did." "Some might have," Holmes said, "but only the guilty would keep listening." Holmes next handed me a thin envelope, sealed crudely in red wax, its surface marred by heat. It had arrived at Baker Street 3 days prior to the incident, addressed in an unfamiliar hand and unsigned. "You dismissed this," he said, "as mere crankery." "I recall," I admitted, "some incoherent line about repentance beneath the bell." "Indeed, but it was the seal that interested me." He passed me a magnifying lens and pointed to the edge of the wax. "Observe this indentation, a curved line, intersected twice." I leaned in. "A signet ring?" "Precisely. Not uncommon in academia, but this one bore a distinct curvature. Cambridge's defunct Harmonic Society used just such a crest. I confirmed it with their secretary. Only 6 such rings were ever issued. 1 belonged to Ellicott, 1 to Brand." "And this was?" "Brand's," Holmes said. "Or rather, it had been. The wax was scorched, indicating contact with heat at the time of sealing. The residue around it contained minute traces of pitch and copper dust, precisely the same compound used in his modified resonance coils." "Which proves what?" "That the letter was not a warning," Holmes replied. "It was a rehearsal. Brand timed the arrival to precede the public notice of Ellicott's lecture. He wanted someone to read it, dismiss it, and forget it. Except the mind he targeted would not forget. It would stew, churn, and wait for the bell." Holmes leaned back. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. Holmes moved to the fireplace and removed a small velvet pouch from the mantel. From within it, he drew a silver tuning fork, etched faintly with numbers and mathematical symbols. He struck it gently against the fire iron and held it aloft. The sound was barely audible, but it lingered, a ghostly vibration in the room's bones. "This," he said, "is a relic of Brand's laboratory. It emits a tone at precisely 34.5 Hz, barely perceptible to the human ear. And yet, held at sufficient proximity, it can loosen mortar, shatter crystal, and even, with repetition, agitate the inner ear to vertigo. I shifted uneasily. You're suggesting Brand used this to drive Ellicott mad? Not merely mad, Holmes said. He used a bank of such frequencies, woven through copper bell cores, and modulated by tuning gears. The resulting sound was not heard, it was felt, a pressure behind the eyes, a tremor in the spine. He gestured toward the sofa. Imagine, Watson, sitting at your desk and sensing the walls throb in silence. You glance at the window and it shudders, but no one else notices. No noise, just sensation. I said nothing. That, Holmes continued, was Brand's vengeance. He did not strike at Ellicott's body. He struck at the line between reality and guilt. Each resonance reinforced the man's belief that he was haunted by sound, by memory, by sin. And the bell? I asked. A symbol and a delivery system. When Ellicott finally heard its real toll, it would only complete the hallucination Brand had spent months rehearsing in him. I exhaled slowly. Holmes placed the fork back in its pouch. The mind, he said, is the most delicate instrument ever constructed. Brand learned to play it and nearly struck its final note. It was only after our long discussion, when the ash in Holmes' pipe had grown cold and the gaslight threw trembling shadows on the bookshelves, that I asked the question which had gnawed at the edge of my mind. You knew, didn't you, I said, about Ellicott's conduct with Miriam Brand. You knew it before we ever took the case. Holmes neither flinched nor shifted his gaze from the ceiling. I suspected, he said, and then I confirmed, and yet you never mentioned it. I saw no value in indulging the past, he replied. The woman in question was long buried, and the man, though once despicable, had since lived beneath the weight of it. The question was not whether he was guilty, Watson. It was whether he had suffered enough to earn the luxury of silence. I was not easily silenced myself, and I found that I resented Holmes for his calm. But surely, I said, the facts matter. What he did, abandoning her, discrediting her name, forcing her into exile, it was monstrous. Unquestionably, Holmes agreed. But ask yourself this. Did Brand seek vengeance for his sister, or for his own shame at not protecting her? Was his device built to punish Ellicott, or to silence that same voice of failure inside himself? I said nothing. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Ellicott was tormented by a bell only he could hear. But guilt, Watson, true guilt, requires no sound at all. It lives behind the eyes and beneath the skin. I turned away, disturbed by the notion. You should have told me, I murmured. I should have, he admitted. But I am not infallible, Watson, only precise. And if Brand had succeeded, then, Holmes said quietly, we should all have heard the bell. That final exchange lingered with me, far longer than I cared to admit. Days passed, and though the case was closed, a restlessness lingered in my thoughts like dust left undisturbed in a forgotten attic. On the fourth morning, as we sat in the lamplight of Baker Street over our tea, I finally put the matter to Holmes. Tell me, I said, do you believe justice was served? He did not look up from his saucer. Do you? I'm not sure. Brand was arrested. Ellicott survived. But what of Miriam? Her name? Her pain? Holmes placed his cup down with care. Ah, Watson, you seek absolutes in a world made of shadow. That sounds evasive. It is, intentionally. Justice, as men understand it, is a matter of courts and punishments. But true balance, true redress, is a subtler mechanism, one that often eludes even the most vigilant of minds. He rose and paced before the fire, hands folded behind his back. Miriam Brand's story was never going to be solved like a cipher. Her dignity could not be restored by exposure, nor her pain soothed by a man in shackles. She required not vengeance, but remembrance, not a trial, but a silence that protected what little of her remained unspoiled. And Ellicott? He lives, Holmes said, and will continue to live in the hollow space between his crime and his reprieve. That, I dare say, is punishment enough. You let him go, I said softly. No, Holmes answered. I simply did not push him further down. He turned to me with that curious glimmer I had seen only in his rarest moods, a sort of grave humour, tinged with weariness. There is mercy, Watson, he said, and then there is wisdom in knowing when to offer it. And with that, he returned to his violin. It was on a dull Thursday afternoon in early November that I found myself once again stepping into the quiet of Baker Street. The fire had been drawn low, and Holmes, ensconced in his armchair, was deeply engaged in a monograph on migratory patterns of northern birds. His pipe lay unlit beside him, an unusual sign of distraction. The air hung with a certain stillness, as if the room itself were exhaling after some great exertion. He greeted me with the barest nod. I took my seat opposite, aware of the silence between us, not oppressive, but earned, like the hush that follows a violent storm. There was nothing to say, yet everything that had passed still hung in the folds of the curtain and the folds of our thoughts. It was not until I ventured a remark about the brevity of the daylight that Holmes looked up, his eyes remote yet alert. Ellicott, he said suddenly, Mattie, will not hear bells in quite the same way again. I tilted my head, waiting. There are intellects, Watson, he continued, of great magnitude and yet pitiful insulation. Logic is armour against the world, but guilt, guilt, seeps through the seams. It is a bell that tolls only within, yet shakes the walls of a man's mind. I thought of Ellicott's pale hands, his sudden silence in the lecture hall, the shadowed room where Holmes had disarmed Brand's monstrous device. He thought he had made peace with the past, Holmes added, but remorse is not a thing one buries. It is a thing that buries you. I said nothing. Holmes had not asked for agreement. He had only spoken the truth. From the street below came the soft, deliberate toll of St. Dunstan's bells, their sound smothered somewhat by the November fog. Holmes did not so much as glance toward the window. You see, Watson, he said, bells may be silenced. Their ropes may be cut, their towers dismantled, but their echoes, those, linger in the ears of those who once heard them. There was something oddly poetic in his tone, almost as if the thought had not come from analysis but feeling. Brand built a machine, Holmes mused, but Ellicott supplied the resonance. Without guilt, there is no chord to strike. That is what our villain understood, consciously or not, and that is what made the crime almost perfect. And yet it failed, I said. Holmes permitted the faintest trace of a smile. Not because of the bell, my dear fellow, because of the echo. That he could not engineer. I leaned back and regarded him, not merely as the keenest mind I had ever known, but as a man, one who had, in his own way, chosen mercy. You could have exposed Ellicott, I said quietly. In full, publicly. I could have, Holmes replied without regret, but I did not. And that decision, was it logical? It was human, he said. There was a moment's stillness between us then, not of uncertainty, but of recognition. There are things, I thought, that no method can dissect, no deduction can master, matters of conscience, of forgiveness, of the quiet calculus of the heart. And for once, I did not feel lesser than Holmes. For once, I suspected we were simply two men, having stood beside the same silence, listening for different truths. A faint tapping broke the quiet. A boy at the window, clutching a yellow envelope. Holmes rose with his usual economy of movement and returned a moment later with the telegram unopened in his hand. Scotland Yard, he said, without a trace of surprise. You're not going to read it? I asked. He shook his head, then settled back into his chair and reached for his pipe. When one bell ceases, he said, striking a match, another prepares to ring. I could not help but smile. And so begins the next case? Likely one with less poetry and more mud, Holmes replied, puffing with satisfaction. But every clanging rattle hides a rhythm, Watson. You need only listen carefully. He said no more. And as the evening grew long and the telegram lay unread upon the mantel, I knew, without being told, that the game was once again afoot. Holmes sat with his long fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded as though watching thoughts pass like clouds over a distant hill. You see, Watson, he murmured at last, reason is but the lantern we carry in the dark corridors of the mind. But guilt, guilt is the echo we cannot silence, no matter how many doors we shut behind us. I said nothing. The bells outside had long stopped ringing, but in Holmes' expression I glimpsed something stranger than deduction, compassion hidden beneath calculation. What do you think? Was Holmes right to withhold the truth about Ellicott's original sin, or did he allow emotion to cloud his legendary reason? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was justice truly served, or merely delayed by mercy? Leave a comment below. And if this case has stirred your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries from the shadows of Baker Street, and share this tale with a fellow detective in your life. The game, as ever, is still afoot.